Have you ever looked back at a decision you made and thought, what was I thinking? Maybe you stayed in a situation far longer than you should have. Perhaps you bought something expensive on impulse that you barely used. Or you chose the option that felt right in the moment, only to realize later it made no practical sense whatsoever. Here's the interesting part. You're not broken and you're not alone. Human beings have been making irrational decisions since the beginning of our species. Despite having the most advanced brains on the planet, capable of incredible logic and reasoning, we consistently choose options that don't serve our best interests. We know we should save money, but we splurge. We know we should eat healthier, but we reach for junk food. We know we should make the practical choice, but we go with our gut instead. So what's going on here? Why do our brains, which can solve complex mathematical equations and create breathtaking art, struggle with everyday decisions? Today, we're diving deep into the psychology behind irrational decision-making. We'll uncover the hidden forces that shape our choices, explore why our minds sometimes work against us, discover what all of this reveals about being human, and most importantly, learn how we can overcome these patterns to make better decisions. Now, before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's great to see how these psychological deep dives connect people from around the world. Now, let's start with a fundamental question. What do we even mean when we talk about rationality? What is rationality? When economists and psychologists talk about rational decision-making, they're usually referring to a specific model. A rational person, in this framework, would consistently make choices that maximize their benefits according to their own values and preferences. They would gather all relevant information, weigh the options objectively, and select the one that gives them the best outcome. This rational person wouldn't let emotions cloud their judgments. They wouldn't be swayed by irrelevant factors. They wouldn't contradict themselves from one moment to the next. Their preferences would be stable and consistent. Sounds reasonable, right? There's just one problem. This person doesn't exist. Real humans are messy. Our preferences shift depending on how questions are framed. We overvalue things we already own. We make different choices when we're tired versus when we're well rested. We're influenced by the order in which we encounter information. We let fear and excitement override careful analysis. For a long time, classical economics assumed these were just minor deviations from the norm. People might make mistakes occasionally, but on average, in the long run, we'd behave rationally. Markets would correct these errors. People would learn from experience. But starting in the 1970s, researchers like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky began documenting something more fundamental. They showed that our deviations from rationality weren't random noise. They were predictable, systematic, and deeply rooted in how our brains process information. They called these patterns cognitive biases and heuristics, and once you start looking for them, you see them everywhere. The two systems of thinking. To understand why we make irrational decisions, we need to understand how our brains actually work when we're making choices. Kahneman popularized a framework that divides our thinking into two systems, which he simply called System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, and effortless. It's the part of your brain that recognizes faces, understands simple sentences, and makes snap judgments. When you see a picture of an angry face, you don't need to consciously analyze the position of the eyebrows and the curve of the mouth. System 1 instantly tells you that person is angry. This system evolved to help us survive. When you're walking through the forest and you see something that looks like a snake, you don't want to stop and carefully analyze whether it's actually a snake or just a curved stick. You want to jump back immediately. System 1 handles that for you. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and effortful. It's what you use when you're solving a complex math problem, learning a new skill, or trying to make a difficult decision. System 2 requires concentration and mental energy. Here's the thing, System 2 is lazy. Or maybe it's more accurate to say it's efficient. Your brain uses an enormous amount of energy, about 20% of your body's total energy expenditure, despite being only 2% of your body weight. So your brain is constantly looking for ways to conserve energy. That means System 1 does most of the heavy lifting in your daily life. It makes quick judgments based on patterns it recognizes. And most of the time, this works pretty well. System 1 is usually right when it tells you that person looks friendly, or that dark alley seems dangerous, or that meal smells delicious. But System 1 also makes mistakes. It takes shortcuts. It relies on rules of thumb that work most of the time, but fail in specific situations. And the tricky part is that System 1 operates so quickly and automatically that we often don't realize it's even running. We feel like we're making careful, rational decisions, but really, System 1 has already made the decision for us, and System 2 is just coming up with reasons to justify it. The anchoring effect. Let's look at one of the most powerful and pervasive biases, anchoring. Imagine I ask you to estimate the population of Chicago. You probably don't know the exact number off the top of your head. So your brain searches for relevant information. You might think about other cities you know the population of, or consider that Chicago is a major city but not as big as New York. Now imagine I ask the question differently. I say, is the population of Chicago more or less than 1 million people? And then I ask you to estimate the actual population. Your answer would be different than if I had asked, is the population of Chicago more or less than 10 million people? Even though the actual population hasn't changed, even though, I'm just throwing out random numbers, those numbers would influence your estimate. This is anchoring. Our brains grab onto the first piece of information we encounter, the anchor, and then adjust from there. But we don't adjust enough. We stay too close to that initial anchor, even when it's completely arbitrary. Researchers have demonstrated this effect hundreds of times in various contexts. In one study, real estate agents were shown the same house, but given different listing prices. The listing price affected their estimates of the home's value, even though they were experienced professionals who should have been able to evaluate the property independently. In another study, judges rolling dice, literal dice, ended up giving longer or shorter sentences based on the random numbers that came up, even though they consciously knew the dice had nothing to do with the case. The anchoring effect shows up in salary negotiations, price assessments, and even medical diagnoses. Doctors can be influenced by the first diagnosis that comes to mind, even when subsequent information points in a different direction. Why does this happen? Because System 1 is always looking for relevant information, and the first number you encounter feels relevant. Your brain assumes there must be some reason that number was mentioned. And because making precise calculations is hard work for System 2, your brain prefers to make small adjustments to the anchor rather than starting from scratch. The scary part is that you can be aware of the anchoring effect and still fall victim to it. Knowing about the bias doesn't make you immune. The only real defense is to actively seek out multiple reference points and force yourself to consider a wide range of possibilities. The availability heuristic. Here's a question. Are you more likely to die in a plane crash or a car accident? If you said plane crash, you're not alone. Many people overestimate the danger of air travel, but the statistics are clear. You're far, far more likely to die in a car accident. In fact, you're safer traveling by plane than by almost any other mode of transportation. So why do we get this wrong? Because of something called the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut where we estimate the likelihood of something based on how easily we can recall examples. If examples come to mind quickly, we assume the thing must be common or probable. Plane crashes are dramatic. They make headlines. They're covered extensively in the news. When a plane goes down, we hear about it for days or weeks. The images stick in our minds. So when someone asks about air safety, we can instantly recall multiple examples of crashes. Car accidents, on the other hand, are so common that they rarely make national news. You might see a brief mention in a local traffic report, but then it's quickly forgotten. Unless the accident involves someone you know, it probably doesn't leave a lasting impression. Because plane crashes are more memorable and easier to recall, our brains conclude they must be more common. Even though the actual data says the opposite, this heuristic affects more than just our fear of flying. It influences how we perceive all kinds of risks. People tend to overestimate the risk of dramatic causes of death, like shark attacks, terrorism, or murder, while underestimating more common but less sensational risks, like heart disease or diabetes. After a highly publicized crime, people believe crime rates are rising, even if they're actually falling. After hearing about a lottery winner, people think winning is more likely than it is. After a friend gets a particular type of illness, we start worrying that we might get it too. The availability heuristic made sense in our evolutionary past. If your tribe encountered a lion and someone got killed, it was genuinely useful to have a heightened fear of lions for a while. The more vividly you could remember the danger, the more carefully you'd look out for it. But in the modern world, our information environment is completely different. We're exposed to news and stories from around the entire planet. Unusual events are systematically brought to our attention precisely because they're unusual. This creates a distorted picture where rare but memorable events feel common, while actual common risks fade into the background. Confirmation bias. We like to believe that we're open-minded, that we follow the evidence wherever it leads, that we can change our minds when presented with new information. But the reality is more complicated. Once we've formed a belief, we tend to seek out information that confirms it and ignore or dismiss information that challenges it. This is confirmation bias, and it's one of the most stubborn obstacles to clear thinking. Imagine you believe that a particular diet is healthy. When you're browsing the internet or reading articles, you'll naturally pay more attention to stories about people who succeeded with that diet. You'll remember the studies that support its benefits. When you encounter criticism of the diet, you might skim over it, or you'll find reasons to discount it. Maybe that study was funded by a competing company. Maybe those people didn't follow the diet correctly. Maybe they had other health issues. You're not being deliberately dishonest. You genuinely believe you're thinking critically. But your brain is subtly steering you toward information that fits what you already believe and away from information that doesn't. Researchers have found that people spend more time reading articles that align with their existing views. When presented with mixed evidence, they rate the quality of studies higher when the conclusions support their beliefs. They can spot methodological flaws in research that contradicts their views, while overlooking the same flaws in research that supports them. This happens even with highly intelligent people. Actually, in some cases, it happens more with intelligent people, because they're better at constructing sophisticated arguments to defend their existing beliefs. Confirmation bias extends beyond just information gathering. It affects how we interpret ambiguous evidence. If you believe a colleague is incompetent, you'll interpret their mistakes as proof of incompetence and their successes as luck or someone else's help. If you believe they're competent, you'll interpret the same events differently. This bias makes it incredibly difficult to have productive conversations about contentious topics. Everyone is cherry-picking evidence, interpreting ambiguous data in ways that support their side, and dismissing opposing arguments. Neither side feels like they're being irrational. Both sides feel like they're just responding to the obvious facts. The mechanism behind confirmation bias involves several factors. One is simply attention. We pay more attention to things we already care about. Another is memory. We remember information better when it fits with our existing knowledge structures. A third is emotional comfort. It feels good when our beliefs are validated and uncomfortable when they're challenged. Breaking out of confirmation bias requires conscious effort. You have to actively seek out opposing viewpoints, steelman arguments you disagree with, meaning you present them in their strongest form rather than attacking weak versions, and genuinely try to imagine what would convince you that you're wrong. Even then, it's hard. Our brains really don't like admitting we were wrong about something. It feels like losing, like a threat to our identity. But the ability to update your beliefs based on evidence is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. The sunk cost fallacy. You've been watching a movie for 45 minutes. It's boring. The characters are flat. The plot isn't going anywhere. You're not enjoying yourself. Should you keep watching? Rationally, the answer is no. The 45 minutes you've already spent is gone no matter what you do. The only question that matters is, would you rather spend the next hour continuing this movie or doing something else? But that's not how most people think about it. They think, I've already invested 45 minutes. If I stop now, that time was wasted. I should finish the movie to make that investment worthwhile. This is the sunk cost fallacy. We let past investments of time, money, or effort influence our current decisions, even when those investments are unrecoverable. Businesses fall into this trap constantly. A company invests millions in developing a new product. As development continues, it becomes clear the product isn't working. The market has changed. The technology isn't as good as competitors, but because they've already spent so much, they keep pouring money into the project. They tell themselves they just need a little more investment to turn things around. Sometimes they end up spending far more trying to salvage a failed project than they would have lost by cutting their losses early. People stay in unfulfilling jobs because they've already spent years there. They continue with the educational programs they've lost interest in because they've already completed several semesters. They repair an old car that keeps breaking down because they've already paid for so many repairs. The logic seems to make sense on the surface. Quitting feels like admitting defeat, like letting all that investment go to waste. But the investment is already gone. Continuing a bad path doesn't recover what you've lost. It just adds new losses on top of old ones. Why do we do this? Part of it is loss aversion, which we'll talk about more in a moment. We really hate losing things. Admitting that our past investment was wasted feels like accepting a loss. Part of it is commitment and consistency. We want to see ourselves as people who finish what they start, who don't give up easily. Changing course feels like we're contradicting our earlier self who made the initial commitment. And part of it is simply how we frame the decision. We focus on what we've already put in rather than what we stand to gain or lose going forward. The key to avoiding the sunk cost fallacy is to recognize that past costs are irrelevant to future decisions. What matters is the future value of continuing versus the future value of stopping. The time, money, or effort you've already spent can't be recovered no matter what you choose. Sometimes the right answer is to push through difficulties and complete what you started, but that should be because you genuinely believe the future payoff is worth it, not because you're trying to justify past investments. Loss aversion. Quick thought experiment. I offer you a coin flip. Heads, you win $100. Tails, you lose $100. Do you take the bet? Most people say no. Even though the expected value is zero, you're equally likely to gain or lose. It doesn't feel like a fair bet. The pain of losing $100 feels stronger than the pleasure of gaining $100. This is loss aversion. Psychologically, losses loom larger than equivalent gains. Research suggests that losses are about twice as powerful as gains. You'd need a potential gain of around $200 to make most people willing to risk losing $100. Loss aversion shows up everywhere in human behavior. It's why people are so reluctant to sell stocks that have declined in value. Selling would turn a paper loss into a real loss, which feels terrible. It's why people often demand more money to give up something they own than they would pay to acquire it in the first place. It's why negative reviews have more impact than positive reviews. From an evolutionary perspective, loss aversion makes some sense. In an environment where you're living close to the edge of survival, a loss could be catastrophic, while a gain might just make things a bit easier. Better to be cautious about risks. But in the modern world, loss aversion often leads us astray. It makes us overly conservative, unwilling to take reasonable risks, even when the potential upward is significant. It makes us hold on to failing investments too long. It makes us fear change, even when change would be beneficial. Loss aversion also makes us vulnerable to manipulation. Marketers know that framing something as avoiding a loss is more powerful than framing it as achieving a gain. Don't miss this opportunity is more compelling than take advantage of this opportunity, even though they mean essentially the same thing. Insurance companies capitalize on loss aversion. We're willing to pay premiums that are mathematically unfavorable because we're so motivated to avoid the potential loss that we overvalue the protection. The key insight is that loss aversion is about feelings, not rational calculations. It doesn't matter that logically, a loss and a gain of the same size should balance out. It matters that emotionally, they don't feel the same. Being aware of loss aversion doesn't make it go away, but it can help you recognize when it's influencing your decisions. When you're facing a choice and you notice yourself feeling very anxious about what you might lose, take a step back. Try to evaluate the situation objectively. What's the actual probability of the loss? What's the magnitude? Is the potential upside worth it? Sometimes the answer will still be no, and that's fine. But you want to make the decision based on clear thinking, not just on the automatic emotional response to potential loss. The framing effect. Imagine a deadly disease outbreak is expected to kill 600 people. Scientists have developed 2 programs to combat it. Program A will save 200 people. Program B has a 1/3 chance of saving all 600 people and a 2/3 chance of saving no one. Which would you choose? Now imagine the same scenario, but described differently. Program C will result in 400 people dying. Program D has a 1/3 chance that nobody will die and a 2/3 chance that all 600 people will die. Which would you choose? Here's the thing. Program A and Program C are identical. Both result in 200 people saved and 400 people dead. Program B and Program D are also identical. Same probabilities, same outcomes. But when researchers present these scenarios to people, they get different answers depending on the framing. When the options are framed in terms of lives saved, most people choose the certain option, Program A. When the options are framed in terms of deaths, most people choose the risky option, Program D. The objective facts haven't changed, only the description has changed, but that description completely alters how people feel about the choice. This is the framing effect, and it's one of the most striking demonstrations of how irrational we can be. We like to think that we evaluate options based on their actual properties, but really, we're heavily influenced by how those options are presented. You see framing everywhere once you start looking. A product labelled 90% fat-free sounds healthier than one labelled 10% fat, even though they're the same. A medical treatment with a 90% survival rate sounds better than one with a 10% mortality rate. Credit card companies fought hard against rules requiring merchants to frame credit card charges as a surcharge rather than framing cash payments as a discount, because they knew a 3% surcharge for credit cards would reduce credit card use more than a 3% discount for cash. Politicians are masters of framing. They don't just advocate for positions, they fight over what to call things. Is it the estate tax or the death tax? Is it pro-choice or pro-abortion? The actual policies don't change, but the frames shape how people feel about them. Framing works because our brains don't naturally translate between different descriptions of the same thing. We respond to the version we hear, not to some abstract underlying reality. When something is framed as a gain, we think about it one way. When it's framed as a loss, we think about it differently. The best defense against framing effects is to consciously reframe decisions multiple ways. If someone presents an option in terms of what you'll gain, rephrase it in terms of what you might lose. If they emphasize certainty, consider the uncertainty. If they talk about percentages, convert to absolute numbers, or vice versa. The goal isn't to eliminate framing entirely, that's probably impossible, but you can at least make yourself aware of how the frame is influencing your perception and try to see the situation from multiple angles. The halo effect. Think of someone you find physically attractive. Now answer this. Are they probably a good person? If you're like most people, you automatically assumed yes, not because you have any actual information about their character, but because attractive people just seem nicer somehow. This is the halo effect. When we like one characteristic of a person or thing, we tend to assume they have other positive characteristics as well. Conversely, if we dislike one trait, we assume they're worse in other ways too. Attractive people are perceived as more intelligent, more competent, more trustworthy, and more likable. They're more likely to be hired, more likely to receive help from strangers, and they even receive lighter sentences when convicted of crimes. None of this has anything to do with their actual abilities or moral character. It's purely based on appearance. The halo effect extends far beyond physical attractiveness. If a company makes products you like, you assume they're well managed and treat their employees well. If someone is articulate and confident, you assume they're knowledgeable, even if they're actually talking nonsense. If a teacher seems warm and friendly, students rate them as a better teacher, regardless of how much students actually learn. This bias causes problems in all kinds of contexts. Job interviews are notoriously unreliable, partly because of the halo effect. An interviewer might be impressed by a candidate's communication skills and unconsciously inflate their assessment of the candidate's technical abilities. Or they might be put off by one awkward moment and rate everything else more negatively. Performance reviews suffer from the same issue. If an employee has had one major success, managers tend to rate them highly across all dimensions. If they've made one serious mistake, they get rated poorly on everything. The halo effect happens because our brains like consistency. When we have one strong impression, positive or negative, our minds automatically fill in the gaps to create a coherent picture. It takes mental effort to maintain a nuanced view where someone is good at some things and bad at others. It's easier to just categorize them as generally good or generally bad. We do this with products, brands, ideas, even entire countries. One positive experience creates a halo that makes us view everything associated with it more favorably. One negative experience creates a horn effect where everything seems worse. The way to combat the halo effect is to deliberately separate different attributes. When evaluating a person, assess each relevant quality independently. Write down your assessment of one dimension before moving to the next, so the first judgment doesn't contaminate the second. When possible, use objective criteria rather than subjective impressions. This is why many companies have moved towards structured interviews with specific questions and scoring rubrics. It's not that these methods are perfect, but they reduce the chance that one strong impression will dominate the entire evaluation. The Dunning-Kruger effect. Have you ever noticed how confident people can be about topics they know very little about? How someone who's read a few articles suddenly feels qualified to debate experts? How beginners sometimes think they're better than they actually are? This isn't just arrogance or stubbornness. It's a genuine cognitive bias called the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes how people with low competence in a domain tend to overestimate their ability, while people with high competence tend to underestimate theirs. Ironically, the less you know, the harder it is to recognize how much you don't know. Why does this happen? Because competence and the ability to recognize competence require the same knowledge. When you're a beginner, you don't even know what you don't know. You're not aware of the subtleties, the edge cases, the complexities that experts deal with. So you look at the basics and think, this isn't so hard, I've got this figured out. As you learn more, you start to realize how much more there is to learn. You encounter complications you didn't anticipate. You discover that things you thought were simple are actually quite nuanced. Your confidence drops because now you can see the gaps in your knowledge. Eventually, with enough experience, your confidence and your competence come back into alignment. But that middle stage, where you know enough to recognize how much you don't know, can be humbling. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows up in countless domains. People consistently overestimate their driving ability, their knowledge of political issues, their understanding of how things work. Studies have found that people who score in the bottom quarter on tests of logic, grammar, or humor consistently believe they scored above average. This has real consequences. It affects how willing people are to seek help or advice. Why would you ask for guidance if you think you already understand the situation? It affects how much effort people put into learning. If you think you're already competent, why practice more? It also affects public discourse. People with limited understanding of complex issues, economics, climate science, medicine, can be very confident in their opinions, while actual experts are more hesitant and hedge their statements with caveats. The first step to overcoming the Dunning-Kruger effect is simply being aware that it exists. When you're learning something new and it feels easy, that's a warning sign. Real competence usually comes with an awareness of complexity and nuance. Seeking feedback is crucial. It's hard to accurately assess your own abilities without external input. A teacher, mentor, or peer review can give you a more realistic picture of where you stand. And perhaps most importantly, cultivate intellectual humility. Recognize that every field has depth you haven't yet explored, and even in areas where you have some knowledge, there are people who know far more. This doesn't mean you can't have opinions or make decisions. It just means holding those opinions with appropriate uncertainty. Present bias and temporal discounting. Let me tell you about two choices. Choice 1, I'll give you $100 today or $110 in a week. Choice 2, I'll give you $100 in a year or $110 in a year plus 1 week. Most people choose the $100 today in the first scenario and the $110 in the second scenario. But notice something strange here. The time difference is the same, 1 week. The money difference is the same, $10. The only thing that's changed is when the delay occurs. Logically, if you're willing to wait a week for an extra $10 a year from now, you should be willing to wait a week for an extra $10 right now. But it doesn't feel that way. Things happening now feel much more real and important than things happening later. This is present bias or temporal discounting. We systematically undervalue future rewards and overvalue immediate ones. A benefit right now feels much bigger than the same benefit later, even when later is just a short time away. This bias is why it's so hard to make choices that benefit our future selves. You know you should save money for retirement, but spending that money now is so much more appealing. You know you should exercise regularly for long-term health, but the couch is comfortable right now. You know you should study for the exam next week, but watching another episode sounds more attractive. The problem gets worse the further in the future the consequences. Saving for retirement in 40 years is much harder than saving for a vacation in 3 months. The long-term consequence just doesn't feel real enough to motivate behavior. Interestingly, we make much more rational decisions about other people's choices. If a friend asks whether they should take $100 now or $110 in a week, you'd probably tell them to wait for the extra $10. But when it's your own money, the immediate option is irresistible. Present bias also makes us procrastinate. Any task with an immediate cost, effort, discomfort, boredom, and a delayed benefit gets pushed to later. We genuinely intend to do it eventually. We just don't want to do it now. The mechanisms behind present bias are complex. Part of it seems to be how our brains process rewards. Immediate rewards activate emotional centers of the brain more strongly. Delayed rewards are more abstract, processed more like hypothetical scenarios than real experiences. There's also an element of uncertainty. A reward now is certain. A reward later might not materialize. Something could go wrong. Plans could change. So there's a rational component to preferring immediate rewards, even if we often take it too far. Fighting present bias requires creating structures that make future consequences feel more immediate. Automatic savings plans work because the money is taken out before you can spend it. Deadlines work because they make the future cost of procrastination feel more real. Visualization techniques can help. If you imagine your future self in vivid detail, you're more likely to make choices that benefit them. Another approach is to remove immediate temptations. If you want to eat healthier, don't keep junk food in the house. If you want to focus on work, turn off notifications. The less you have to rely on willpower in the moment, the better. The gambler's fallacy. Imagine you're watching someone flip a fair coin. It comes up heads 5 times in a row. What's more likely on the next flip, heads or tails? If you said tails, you've just fallen for the gambler's fallacy. The correct answer is that both outcomes are equally likely. Every coin flip is independent. The coin doesn't remember what happened before. The fact that it came up heads 5 times doesn't make tails more likely on the next flip. The probability is still 50-50, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like tails is due, like the universe should balance things out. Like after 5 heads, tails has to come up eventually to even things out. This intuition is completely wrong, but it's incredibly persistent. People bet on numbers in roulette that haven't come up recently. They buy lottery tickets with numbers that haven't been drawn. They assume that a sports team that's won several games in a row is due for a loss. The opposite mistake is also common, the hot hand fallacy. This is when people believe that a streak will continue. A basketball player who's made several shots in a row is hot and will probably make the next one too. Both of these are mistakes in understanding randomness. Random sequences don't look as random as we expect. If you flip a coin 100 times, you'll get several streaks of 4 or 5 of the same result. That's completely normal for a random sequence, but it feels like it shouldn't happen. Our brains are pattern-matching machines. We evolved to detect cause and effect, to notice when one thing leads to another. This is incredibly useful most of the time, but it means we see patterns even in completely random data. The gambler's fallacy causes problems beyond casinos. It affects how we interpret data in all kinds of contexts. After a string of good days, we might think bad luck is coming. After several negative events, we might think things have to get better. But if the events are independent, and many more things are independent than we realize, then the past doesn't predict the future in the way we intuitively expect. Understanding randomness is genuinely difficult. Our intuitions actively mislead us. The best approach is to remember that when events are truly independent, the past doesn't influence the future. Each event is a fresh start with its own probabilities, social proof, and conformity. You're walking down the street and you see a crowd of people standing on the sidewalk, all looking up at something. What do? If you're like most people, you stop and look up too. You don't know what they're looking at. Maybe there's nothing there at all, but the fact that everyone else is doing it makes you think there must be something worth seeing. This is social proof, the tendency to look to others to determine what's correct or appropriate. We assume that if everyone else is doing something, they must know something we don't. Social proof is powerful. It influences what we buy, what we believe, what we think is acceptable behavior. Advertisers love to tell you that their product is the fastest growing or most popular because they know that makes you more likely to buy it. Charities mention that your neighbours have donated because it makes you more likely to donate too. The power of social proof was demonstrated dramatically in a series of experiments by Solomon Asch in the 1950s. He showed participants a line and asked them to identify which of three other lines was the same length. It was an easy task, the answer was obvious, but Ash had secretly instructed several other participants to give the wrong answer. What happened? About a third of the time, the real participant went along with the group's incorrect answer, even though their own eyes told them something different. When interviewed afterward, some participants said they genuinely came to believe the group was right. Others said they knew the group was wrong, but didn't want to stand out or seem foolish. Both reactions show the power of social pressure. Conformity isn't always bad. In many situations, following what others do is a reasonable strategy. If you're in an unfamiliar place and don't know the local customs, watching what locals do makes sense. If you're unsure about a decision and experts or experienced people are doing something specific, their behavior is useful information. The problem comes when social proof overrides our own judgment, or when everyone is following each other without anyone actually knowing if it's the right thing to do. This can create information cascades, where everyone is basing their decision on what others are doing, but those others are also just following the crowd. Financial bubbles often involve this kind of cascade. People invest in something not because they've carefully evaluated it, but because everyone else is investing and they don't want to miss out. Then when the bubble bursts, everyone rushes to sell for the same reason. Breaking free from social proof requires confidence in your own judgment and a willingness to be different from the group. It means asking yourself, am I doing this because I actually think it's right, or just because everyone else is doing it? It also helps to remember that groups can be wrong. Throughout history, there are countless examples of majority opinion later being recognized as misguided. Popular doesn't mean correct. The illusion of control. Imagine you're playing the lottery. You have two options. You can let the machine randomly generate your numbers, or you can choose your own numbers. Which do you prefer? Most people want to choose their own numbers. It feels like it gives them a better chance of winning, even though logically, every combination of numbers has exactly the same probability of being drawn. This is the illusion of control, our tendency to believe we can influence outcomes that are actually determined by chance. The illusion of control shows up in surprisingly many places. People throw dice harder when they want high numbers and softer when they want low numbers. Investors believe they can beat the market through careful stock picking, even though research shows that random selection often performs just as well as expert choices. Gamblers develop elaborate systems and rituals because they believe it helps them win. The illusion is stronger when several factors are present. When you're actively involved rather than passive, you feel more control. When you're familiar with the task, even if the outcome is random, you feel more control. When you've had early successes, you attribute them to skill rather than luck. This bias isn't entirely irrational. In most of life, your actions do influence outcomes. Practice does make you better at skills. Careful planning does improve your chances of success. The problem is that we generalize this pattern to situations where it doesn't apply. We also tend to take credit for successes while blaming failures on external factors. If your stock picks do well, you're a savvy investor. If they do poorly, the market was unpredictable. This self-serving attribution helps maintain the illusion that you're in control. The illusion of control can be harmful when it leads to excessive risk-taking. If you believe you have more control than you actually do, you might take on dangerous ventures, ignore warning signs, or fail to prepare for things going wrong. But interestingly, the illusion of control can also have benefits. People who feel they have control over their lives tend to be happier and more resilient. Even if the control is somewhat illusory, the belief itself can be motivating. It encourages people to take action rather than giving up passively. The key is finding balance. You want enough sense of control to stay motivated and engaged, but enough realism to recognize when outcomes genuinely aren't in your hands. You want to focus your efforts on things you can actually influence while accepting the role of chance and circumstance in your life. Mental accounting. Here's a scenario. You've bought a ticket to a concert for $50. When you arrive at the venue, you realize you've lost the ticket. Would you buy another ticket for $50? Now consider a different scenario. You're planning to buy a ticket to a concert for $50. When you arrive at the venue, you realize you've lost $50 from your wallet. Would you still buy the ticket? Logically, these situations are identical. In both cases, you're $50 poorer and need to decide whether to spend another $50 on the concert. But most people are more willing to buy the ticket in the second scenario than the first. Why? Because of mental accounting. We don't treat all money the same way. We create different mental categories, and we treat losses differently depending on which category they fall into. In the first scenario, the lost ticket and the potential new ticket are in the same mental account, the concert expense category. Buying a second ticket feels like you're paying $100 for the concert, which seems excessive. In the second scenario, the lost cash comes from a general fund while the concert ticket is its own category. The lost money feels separate from the concert expense, so buying the ticket still feels like you're only spending $50 on entertainment. Mental accounting affects behavior in countless ways. People treat bonuses differently than regular salary, even though money is money. They're more willing to spend a tax refund than an equivalent amount from savings. They keep separate accounts for different purposes: vacation fund, emergency fund, retirement, even when combining them would be more efficient. This bias can lead to poor financial decisions. Someone might carry credit card debt at 18% interest, while keeping money in a savings account, earning 2% interest because they've mentally categorized them differently. They think of the savings as untouchable, even though using it to pay off debt would save them money. But mental accounting isn't entirely irrational. It can serve as a useful tool for self-control. By creating separate mental categories, people can restrict their spending in ways that might be harder if they viewed all their money as one fungible resource. Setting aside money for specific purposes helps ensure you'll have resources available when you need them. The problem comes when mental accounting leads to contradictory or inefficient choices. The key is to be aware of how you're categorizing money and decisions, and to occasionally step back and ask whether those categories are serving you well or leading you astray. The planning fallacy. Think about a project you completed recently. Did it take more time, less time, or exactly as much time as you originally expected? If you're like most people, it probably took longer, maybe a lot longer. This pattern is so common that it has a name: the planning fallacy. We consistently underestimate how long tasks will take, how much they'll cost, and how difficult they'll be. Major construction projects regularly run over budget and behind schedule. Students underestimate how long papers will take to write. People underestimate how long their commutes will be, how long home repairs will take, how long it will take to get ready for an event. The planning fallacy happens because when we plan, we imagine an idealized version of the future where everything goes smoothly. We think about the steps we need to take and estimate based on those steps going exactly as planned. But reality is messy. Unexpected problems arise. Tasks take longer than expected. You get interrupted. Materials aren't available. Other people don't respond as quickly as you hoped. You underestimate how much time routine tasks consume. Interestingly, we're much better at predicting how long things will take other people. When you ask someone how long their project will take, and then you make your own estimate, your estimate is often more accurate than theirs. Because you're not imagining an idealized version, you're factoring in the typical problems and delays. This suggests that the planning fallacy isn't just about poor estimation skills, it's about psychological factors. We want to believe things will go well. We're optimistic about our own abilities. We don't want to admit to ourselves or others that something will be difficult or time-consuming. There's also a motivation component. If you're trying to get approval for a project, you have an incentive to make it sound quick and easy. If you told yourself or others the realistic timeline, you might not start at all. The planning fallacy has serious consequences. It leads to rushed work when deadlines approach. It creates stress and disappointment. It means we consistently overpromise and underdeliver. The best remedy is to look at past experience with similar tasks. How long did it actually take last time you did something like this? What went wrong that you didn't anticipate? Using historical data rather than optimistic projections produces much more accurate estimates. Another technique is to add buffer time explicitly. If you think something will take 5 hours, plan for 7 or 8. Yes, you might finish early sometimes, but you'll much more often be grateful for the extra time. Hindsight bias. After a major event happens, it often feels obvious in retrospect. People say things like, "I knew that was going to happen," or "it was so predictable," or "the signs were all there." But were the signs really all there? Or does it just feel that way now that you know the outcome? This is hindsight bias, sometimes called the "I knew it all along" effect. After an event occurs, we tend to see it as having been more predictable than it actually was. We unconsciously revise our memory of what we thought beforehand to align with what actually happened. Research has demonstrated this repeatedly. In one classic study, psychologists asked people to predict the outcome of a historical event they were unfamiliar with. Then they told half the people one outcome and half the people a different outcome, and asked them to recall their original prediction. People's memories shifted toward whatever outcome they'd been told had happened. Hindsight bias affects how we evaluate decisions. When something goes wrong, we're quick to say the person who made the decision should have known better. We see all the warning signs as obvious. But before the outcome was known, those same signs might have been ambiguous or contradictory. This creates unfairness in how we judge others and ourselves. We blame people for not foreseeing things that weren't actually foreseeable. We criticize past decisions based on information that wasn't available at the time. Hindsight bias also prevents learning. If you believe you knew it all along, you don't update your understanding of how the world works. You don't recognize that you were actually uncertain or that you made a mistake in judgment. This means you're likely to make the same mistakes again. In professional contexts, hindsight bias can be particularly damaging. Medical errors are often evaluated in hindsight, with reviewers identifying all the signs that should have been noticed. But in the moment, with incomplete information and time pressure, those signs weren't necessarily obvious. This can lead to unfair criticism of doctors and make them more defensive rather than promoting genuine learning. The same happens in business. After a product fails, everyone can identify why it was a bad idea. After a company succeeds, their strategy seems brilliant. But in both cases, there was genuine uncertainty at the time. Many products that seemed sure to succeed have failed, and many that seemed risky have thrived. Fighting hindsight bias requires conscious effort. When evaluating past decisions, try to remember or reconstruct what information was actually available at the time. What were the alternatives? What did people believe then? Not what you know now. It also helps to write down your predictions and reasoning before outcomes are known. This creates a record that's harder to unconsciously revise. You can look back and see what you actually thought, rather than what you now remember thinking. The endowment effect. Imagine I give you a coffee mug. It's a nice mug worth about $5. I ask you how much money you'd be willing to accept to sell it back to me. What do you say? Now imagine instead that I show you the same mug and ask if you'd like to buy it. How much would you pay? Logically, these amounts should be similar. The value of the mug to you shouldn't depend on whether you currently own it. But research consistently finds that people demand more money to give up something they own than they'd be willing to pay to acquire it. This is the endowment effect. Simply owning something makes it more valuable to us. The effect is surprisingly strong. In experiments, people given a mug and asked to sell it typically want around $7, while people asked to buy the same mug offer around $3. That's more than a twofold difference based purely on ownership. The endowment effect contributes to why people hold on to things they don't use. That exercise equipment gathering dust in the corner? If you didn't own it, you wouldn't pay what someone would need to offer to take it from you. But because you do own it, it feels valuable, and so you keep it. The endowment effect also makes negotiations difficult. Sellers value what they're selling more than buyers value it, creating a gap that's hard to bridge. Both sides feel like they're being reasonable, but they're starting from different baselines. Part of the endowment effect is about loss aversion. Giving up something you own feels like a loss, and we hate losses. Acquiring something new feels like a gain, and gains don't excite us as much as equivalent losses pain us. But there's more to it than that. Ownership seems to change how we perceive objects. Once something is mine, we notice its positive features more. We think about how we've used it, imagine how we might use it in the future. We form an attachment. This psychological process probably served a purpose evolutionarily. In a world where you couldn't easily replace possessions, being attached to what you owned and reluctant to trade it away helped you keep valuable resources. But in a modern economy, with abundant goods and easy transactions, the endowment effect can hold us back. It makes us reluctant to sell things we should sell. It makes us demand unrealistic prices. It fills our homes with items we don't really want anymore, but can't bear to part with. The way to counteract the endowment effect is to try to view your possessions more objectively. Ask yourself, if I didn't own this, would I buy it at this price? If I was starting fresh today, would this be something I'd acquire? This mental reset can help you see things more clearly. Recency, bias, and the peak end rule. Quick question: how was your last vacation? When you answer that question, you're probably not calculating the average quality of every moment. You're not systematically going through each day and weighing the good parts against the bad parts. Instead, a few moments stand out in your memory. Maybe the best moment, that incredible sunset or that perfect meal. Maybe the final moments, how you felt as you were leaving, or the last day of the trip. These moments shape your overall evaluation much more than they logically should. This is the peak end rule. When we remember experiences, we don't average across the entire duration. We focus heavily on the peak moment, the best or worst part, and the ending. This has surprising implications. In one study, researchers had people put their hand in painfully cold water. One group kept their hand in cold water for 60 seconds. Another group kept their hand in for 60 seconds. Then for an additional 30 seconds, while the water was slightly warmed. Still uncomfortable, but less painful. Which group remembered the experience as worse? The first group. Even though they experienced strictly less total pain, the fact that the second group ended with a less painful period made the whole experience seem more bearable in retrospect. The peak end rule explains why endings matter so much. A movie with a disappointing ending colours your entire perception of the film, even if the first 90% was great. A meal with a mediocre dessert feels less satisfying than one with a wonderful dessert, even if the main courses were identical. Healthcare providers have learned to apply this principle. Some procedures add a less painful phase at the end specifically to improve patients' memories of the experience, even though it increases total discomfort. Related to this is recency bias, our tendency to weight recent experiences more heavily than older ones. If you've had several good experiences with a product followed by one bad experience, the bad experience dominates your evaluation. If a friend has been wonderful for years but annoying lately, you think of them as annoying. Recency bias affects financial decisions. After the market goes up for several years, people extrapolate that trend and expect continued growth. After it crashes, they expect continued decline. Neither prediction is necessarily accurate, but recent experience shapes expectations. These biases aren't entirely irrational. Recent information is often more relevant than old information. The peak of an experience might reveal something important about its nature, but we take these reasonable tendencies too far, letting a few salient moments overwhelm the full picture. Being aware of peak end and recency effects can help you make better evaluations. When assessing an experience, we try to remember more than just the highlights and the ending. When making predictions, look at long-term patterns rather than just recent events. The illusion of explanatory depth. Here's a thought experiment. Describe in detail how a bicycle works. Not just you pedal and it moves, but the actual mechanism. How do the pedals transfer power to the wheels? What role does the chain play? How do gears change the effort required? Most people feel confident they understand how a bicycle works until they try to explain it. Then they realize their understanding is much shallower than they thought. This is the illusion of explanatory depth. We believe we understand how things work in much more detail than we actually do. We feel like we know until we're asked to explain. This illusion extends to basically everything. How does a toilet work? How does a zipper work? How does a helicopter stay in the air? How do international trade agreements work? How does the immune system respond to illness? For most of these, you probably have a vague sense, but nowhere near the detailed understanding you feel like you have. Your brain confuses familiarity with comprehension. You've seen bicycles and toilets and zippers many times. You've heard about trade agreements and the immune system, so you feel like you understand them. The illusion of explanatory depth has important consequences for decision-making. When you think you understand something better than you do, you're overconfident in your judgments about it. You might support or oppose ideas without really grasping what they entail. Research has shown that asking people to explain how a concept works, really explain it in detail, reduces their confidence and makes them more moderate in their views. The act of trying to explain reveals the gaps in your knowledge. This suggests a powerful tool for better thinking. Try to explain things. Don't just form an opinion, articulate the reasoning behind it. Don't just feel like you understand, try to describe the mechanism. The effort to explain forces you to confront what you actually know versus what you only think you know. The illusion of explanatory depth is related to the broader phenomenon of overconfidence. We systematically overestimate how much we know, how accurate our predictions are, how good our memories are. This overconfidence isn't just bragging or showing off. We genuinely believe we're more knowledgeable than we are. Intellectual humility, recognizing the limits of your understanding, is difficult but valuable. It makes you more willing to learn, more open to others' perspectives, more careful in your reasoning. And ironically, by acknowledging what you don't know, you often end up knowing more than people who are too confident to question themselves. Emotional reasoning. Here's a common pattern of thinking. I feel anxious about flying, therefore flying must be dangerous. Or, I feel uncomfortable around that person, therefore they must be untrustworthy. Or, this decision feels wrong, therefore it is wrong. This is emotional reasoning, using your emotional state as evidence about reality. You feel a certain way, so you conclude that your feeling accurately reflects the situation. The problem is that emotions aren't always reliable guides to truth. You can feel anxious about things that are objectively safe. You can feel comfortable with people who are actually untrustworthy. You can feel good about decisions that are actually poor. Emotions provide useful information. They alert you to things that might be important. Fear can signal danger. Discomfort can indicate that something's off. But emotions aren't the same as facts. They're reactions that need to be evaluated, not certainties that should be automatically trusted. Emotional reasoning becomes particularly problematic when emotions are intense. Strong feelings are so compelling that they overwhelm other considerations. In the grip of anger, you're certain that person deserves your rage. In the grip of fear, you're certain the danger is real. In the grip of infatuation, you're certain this relationship is meant to be. Later, when the emotion subsides, you might see the situation differently. The person wasn't as bad as you thought. The danger wasn't as serious. The relationship had obvious problems you ignored. But in the moment, the emotion feels like truth. This is why people sometimes talk about hot versus cold decision-making. When you're in a hot emotional state, angry, afraid, excited, you make different choices than when you're in a cold state. Research shows that people in different emotional states can make completely opposite choices about the same situation. The solution isn't to ignore emotions entirely. Emotions contain valuable information about your values, your needs, and your reactions to situations. But they need to be considered alongside other information, not treated as the final word. When you notice yourself engaging in emotional reasoning, pause, ask yourself, is there actual evidence for this belief? Or am I just reasoning from my feelings? What would I think about this situation if I felt differently? What would an outside observer conclude? Sometimes this reflection will confirm that your emotion is pointing you in the right direction, but sometimes you'll realize the emotion is based on a misunderstanding, a past experience that's not relevant now, or just a temporary physiological state. The narrative fallacy. Humans love stories. We understand the world through narratives. We explain events by constructing coherent stories about causes and effects, about heroes and villains, about struggles and resolutions. The problem is that the world doesn't always work like a story. Many events are influenced by randomness, by countless small factors, by complex interactions that don't reduce to a simple narrative. But our brains impose narrative structures anyway. This is the narrative fallacy, our tendency to construct stories to explain events, even when those stories are oversimplified or inaccurate. After something happens, we create a narrative that makes it seem inevitable. We identify the key factors, the turning points, the reasons why things had to unfold the way they did. This narrative feels satisfying and complete. But this is often a post hoc reconstruction. Before the event, things were much more uncertain. There were multiple possible outcomes. Many factors that seem crucial in retrospect were not clearly important at the time. The narrative fallacy makes us see patterns where there might just be noise. It makes us feel like we understand events when we're really just telling ourselves a convincing story. It makes us overconfident about predicting future events because we believe we understand the past. Consider business success stories. When a company succeeds, people write articles explaining exactly why it succeeded. They identify the brilliant decisions, the key innovations, the leadership qualities that made the difference. The story is clean and causal, but many companies make similar decisions and fail. Many innovations don't succeed. Many leaders with similar qualities don't achieve the same results. The success story cherry-picks the factors that fit the narrative and ignores the role of timing, luck, and the countless things that could have gone differently. The narrative fallacy is related to hindsight bias, but it goes further. It's not just that we think we knew it all along. It's that we construct an entire story framework that makes the event seem to follow logically from what came before. This matters because narratives shape how we make decisions. If you believe success follows from particular actions, you'll try to repeat those actions. But if the original success involved substantial luck or factors you've misidentified, your attempts to replicate it will fail. The way to resist the narrative fallacy is to remain skeptical of clean, simple explanations. Real causation is usually messy. Multiple factors contribute to outcomes. Randomness plays a larger role than we like to admit. Alternative outcomes were often possible. This doesn't mean narratives are useless. Stories help us communicate and remember. But we should hold them lightly, recognizing that they're simplified models, not complete representations of reality. The status quo bias. Imagine you inherit a large sum of money that's currently invested in a portfolio of stocks and bonds. The portfolio is reasonable, but not optimal for your goals. Do you stick with it or change it to better match your needs? Now imagine you inherit the same amount of money in cash. Do you invest it in that same portfolio of stocks and bonds, or do you create a different allocation? Most people are more likely to keep the existing portfolio than to actively choose to create it. Even though the situations are economically identical, you have the same amount of money and the same range of options, the fact that one starts with a particular state makes you more likely to stick with it. This is status quo bias. We have a general preference for things to stay as they are. Change requires effort, involves risk, and feels uncomfortable. The current state of affairs, simply by being current, carries weight in our decisions. Status quo bias shows up everywhere. People stick with default options even when better alternatives are easily available. They stay with service providers they're dissatisfied with because switching seems like too much hassle. They keep routines and habits long after they've stopped serving them well. This bias has huge implications for public opinion and behaviour. Once a particular system or arrangement is in place, it becomes sticky. People adapt to it, become familiar with it, and resist changes even when those changes would be improvements. Part of status quo bias is about loss aversion. Changing means giving up the current state, which feels like a loss. Even if the change would bring benefits, those benefits feel less powerful than the loss of what you have now. Part of it is about effort and uncertainty. Staying with the current situation requires no decision-making. You can just continue on autopilot. Change requires thinking, researching, making choices. And change involves uncertainty about whether you'll actually be better off. There's also a psychological commitment to past decisions. The status quo usually exists because you or someone made a choice to create it. Changing it feels like admitting that choice was wrong. Status quo bias can be manipulated. The default option in any situation tends to be the most commonly chosen, even when it's not the best. Companies know this and use it strategically. The default privacy settings, the default insurance option, the default donation amount. All of these have disproportionate influence. To overcome status quo bias, periodically ask yourself, if I were starting from scratch today, what would I choose? If your honest answer is different from your current situation, that's a sign you might be stuck in a status quo that no longer serves you. Closing thoughts. We've covered a lot of ground here. Anchoring effects, confirmation bias, sunk cost fallacy, loss aversion, framing effects, social proof, and many more. It might seem overwhelming. It might even seem depressing. If our thinking is riddled with all these biases, how can we ever make good decisions? But here's the thing. Recognizing these patterns isn't about beating yourself up over being irrational. It's about understanding the tools you have and their limitations. Your brain is an incredible instrument. These mental shortcuts we've discussed aren't bugs. They're features that evolved because they usually work well enough. The problem is that the modern world is very different from the environment our brains evolved in. We're bombarded with information. We face decisions our ancestors never encountered. We live in systems deliberately designed to exploit our psychological quirks. Understanding cognitive biases gives you a fighting chance. Not to become perfectly rational, that's probably impossible, and maybe not even desirable, but to catch yourself when your mental shortcuts might be leading you astray. Here are some practical takeaways. First, slow down. Many biases thrive on quick, automatic thinking. When you're making an important decision, take the time to engage your deliberate, analytical thinking. Sleep on it. Seek additional information. Consider alternatives. Second, seek outside perspectives. Other people don't have the same blind spots you do. They're not anchored by the same initial numbers. They're not committed to the same past decisions. They can see things you miss. Of course, they have their own biases, but diversity of perspectives helps cancel out individual biases. Third, write things down. Your memory is malleable. You'll unconsciously revise what you thought in the past to align with what happened. By keeping records of your predictions, your reasoning, and your decisions, you create an accurate baseline for learning from experience. Fourth, embrace uncertainty. A lot of irrational thinking comes from being overconfident, believing we know more than we do, believing outcomes are more predictable than they are. Cultivating intellectual humility, being comfortable saying, I don't know, and holding beliefs probabilistically rather than as certainties all reduce the impact of various biases. Fifth, create systems and structures. Don't rely purely on willpower and good intentions. Set up automatic savings so you don't have to overcome present bias every month. Create checklists to ensure you consider all relevant factors. Establish decision rules in advance so you're not swayed by emotions in the moment. Sixth, study the actual data. Our intuitions about probabilities, about risks, about causes and effects, they're often wrong. When something matters, look at the actual evidence rather than relying on what feels true. Numbers aren't perfect, but they're often more reliable than gut feelings. And finally, be patient with yourself and others. Everyone makes irrational decisions. Everyone falls victim to these biases. Understanding this can make you more compassionate toward yourself when you make mistakes, and toward others when they seem to be making obviously poor choices. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is to be slightly better at seeing clearly, thinking carefully, and making choices that serve your actual values and goals rather than being hijacked by mental shortcuts that don't apply to the situation at hand. We are all irrational. We all take mental shortcuts. We all let emotions override logic sometimes. We all see patterns that aren't there and miss patterns that are. This is part of being human, but by understanding how our minds work, the systematic ways they deviate from pure rationality, we can work with our psychology rather than against it. We can recognize when we're likely to make mistakes and put guardrails in place. We can question our intuitions when they matter most. We can build decision-making processes that compensate for our natural biases. The story of human irrationality isn't a pessimistic one. It's actually quite optimistic. Because once you understand these patterns, you can start to see them in action. You can catch yourself reaching for the familiar when the novel would be better. You can notice when you're letting sunk costs drive your choices. You can recognize when social proof is pulling you towards something that doesn't actually make sense for you. This awareness doesn't make you perfectly rational, but it makes you more thoughtful, more deliberate, more effective at navigating a complex world full of difficult choices. And that's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually. So the next time you're standing in a supermarket, staring at 3 options, and you find yourself gravitating toward the middle-priced one for no clear reason, pause, take a breath, ask yourself what's actually happening in your brain. Maybe you'll stick with that choice anyway, but at least you'll know why. At least you'll have made the decision consciously rather than being unconsciously manipulated by the very predictable quirks of human psychology. That's the power of understanding why humans make irrational decisions. Not to transcend our humanity, but to navigate it more skillfully. Not to eliminate all bias, but to recognize it and compensate when it matters. We are wonderfully complex creatures, capable of incredible rationality and spectacular irrationality, often in the same moment. Understanding this paradox, really understanding it, might be one of the most rational things we can do. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, consider sharing it with someone who might benefit from understanding their own thinking a bit better. And remember, the next time you make a decision that doesn't quite make sense in retrospect, you're not broken, you're just human. And now you understand a bit more about what that means.